Good morning, everybody. If you're just joining us, thank you for joining us. We're going to wait maybe like 2, 3 more minutes so others can join us as well. And then we'll start today's morning scoop. Again, thank you for joining us. If you just joined in, we are going to wait maybe just 2 more minutes, something like that, so others can, or 1 minute can join us as well, and then we are going to start. All right, I think we are going to start. Good morning, everyone. My name is Luigi Del Puerto. I'm the publisher and editor of the Arizona Capital Times. The Arizona Capital Times, of course, covers state government and state politics. And if you don't have a subscription, please let me know. We'll get you squared away. The 2020 elections were historic, both in size and in scope. Record number of Arizonans voted in what was one of the most contentious elections in recent memory. All of that in the middle of a pandemic. We will talk about the challenges and successes of the 2020 elections and, given that experience, what 2022 might look like. But first, I want to thank our sponsor this morning for engaging with us this way. I want to thank the Arizona Citizens Clean Elections Commission for sponsoring this series. The commission that administers the Citizens Clean Elections Act, which voters passed in 1998. The act seeks to restore citizen participation and confidence in the political system, improve the integrity of the Arizona state government, and promote freedom of speech under the US and Arizona constitutions. Last year, and just like every election cycle, the commission organized a series of debates so voters have the opportunity to hear directly from the candidates, ask questions on the issues that matter most to them, and of course, vote informed. We have a great panel this morning. Joining us is Gina Roberts, who is the Voter Education Director of the Citizens Clean Elections Commission. In this role, she administers a robust public education program that strives to encourage participation in the political process from voters across the state. Gina is well versed in election policy and administration, having administered elections for the city of Peoria and serving as the elections manager for the Secretary of State. She graduated from Arizona State University with a degree in political science and has been a certified election officer since 2009. She was honored with the Breakouts 2018 award from the Arizona Capital Times, and she is also a 2019 fellow for the Flynn Brown Civic Leadership Academy. Gina, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Luigi. Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Also joining us this morning is Leslie Hoffman, who is the recorder of Yavapai County. Leslie was appointed to serve as the Yavapai County Recorder by the Board of Supervisors on January 2012, after 20 years in the title industry in the county. In November 2012, she was elected to office and then re-elected again in 2016. Leslie is the president of the Arizona Association of Counties, a member of the Election Officials of Arizona and Election Center. She sits on the National Association of Counties Finance, Pensions, and Intergovernmental Affairs Steering Committee. She's a member of the Circle of Advisors for the National Vote at Home Institute, a member of the Republican Women of Prescott, and she's also past president of the Arizona Association of County Recorders. Leslie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Also joining us is Lisa Mara, who is the Director of Elections at Cochise County. Lisa has been with the Cochise County since 2012 and was appointed Director of Elections in 2017 after serving as Community Relations Administrator for the Board of Supervisors, a role in which he oversaw legislative affairs, public relations, grant writing, and management of federal funds. Prior to leaving Phoenix to relocate to Southern Arizona and focus on the needs of rural communities, she served as Vice President of Workforce Policy at the Arizona Chapter, Associated General Contractors, where she directed all aspects of workforce development and membership services for the nation's oldest and largest construction trade association. By the way, AGC is right by the Capitol Times in the same complex. Lisa is serving her second term as president of the Election Officials Association of Arizona and is currently on the Arizona Secretary of State's Election Officer Certification Curriculum Committee. She and her husband, Tom, live in Palominas on a historic ranch property near the border with Mexico. Lisa, thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for being here with us.
And finally, joining us this morning is Tammy Patrick, who's the Senior Advisor for Elections at Democracy Fund, a group that works to ensure America's political system can withstand new challenges and deliver on its promise to the American people. In 2013, she was selected by President Obama to serve as a commissioner on the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, which led to a position at the Bipartisan Policy Center to further the work of the commission. Prior to that, she was the Federal Compliance Officer for Maricopa County Elections Department for 11 years. She serves as an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Policy and has represented the National Association of Election Officials to the United States Postal Service's Mailers Technical Advisory Committee, a role in which she's done for over a decade. She holds a bachelor's degree in American Studies from Purdue University and is certified by Auburn University as a certified elections registration administrator. Tammy, thank you for joining us.
Well, good morning, everyone. I wouldn't pass this up for the world. It's great to see you all.
Thank you. So I want to go to Gina. Gina, if you can bring us back to 2020 and give us, it wasn't too long ago. It was just a couple months ago, and we're still kind of dealing with 2020. But, bring us back to 2020. What was the mood then? And really, from your perspective, I want to know what kinds of questions you were getting from the voters.
Sure. So 2020 was quite the year, very challenging for election officials and voters and candidates as well. Obviously, we had to have elections administered during COVID. But I want to remind everybody, we actually had 3 statewide elections in 2020. I know a lot of focus has been on the presidential election, but we started off with our presidential preference election. And then, of course, we had our statewide primary and our general election. And I would say, I feel like from my perspective, from what I heard from voters throughout the year, all was pretty calm during the PPE and during the primary, even with the concerns about COVID. I think our election officials, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, did a really great job of ensuring that, voters who wanted to vote in person were safe, our poll workers were safe. And of course, we know most of our state votes by mail. But I think when we got into the general election, that's really when we started to hear from voters about concerns that they had. And I think a lot of the concerns were really fed from misinformation that we were seeing both coming from inside Arizona, but also nationally. So, just a reminder that the state of Arizona, we had 3 successful elections during 2020. And again, I think that most of the feedback, the questions, and the contacts that we've had from voters really started to pick up during the general election, which, of course, we know had one of the highest turnouts in our state's history. So it was quite a lot of focus on Arizona during that general election.
Thank you, Gina. I want to go to Leslie. What about in your case, ma'am? You're dealing with a pandemic, and at the same time, it was a pretty big election year. Bring us back to, I guess the more specific question I have for you is that how did you ensure, for example, that Gina had mentioned the safety of the poll workers, but also the safety of the public, and ensuring that our elections, in fact, did not become what many would refer to as a super spreader event?
Right. Well, as the recorder, I have the 27 days of early voting prior to the election. So that was my key responsibility. And we all worked together around the state. Well, everybody here can attest to that on what are some best practices, making sure we had the sanitizers, provided masks, provided gloves. We actually used our volunteers in protection, the VIPs in the sheriff's department, and they came in and helped us with line mitigation and just asking people, offering masks, offering gloves, offering sanitizer. And we just kept the people moving. Again, historic turnout, we had 87% turnout. And
I'm sorry, did you say 87% turnout?
Yes,
Is that the highest in the state then?
yes.
Okay.
We have a very engaged community in Navajo. And so and early voting was huge. We asked people to come out, go, well, one, turn in your ballots early, and they did. And then if they had any concerns on election day, to come in and vote early. And I had never seen lines like we had for early voting, but everybody was really good to each other, and they were good to us. Election day, I'll kind of defer that to Lisa, and she does the election day as the election director.
So I want to ask you, of the 87% who actually cast the ballot, what was the percentage for those who voted early?
Almost 90%.
Almost 90%. Okay, that's par for the course, I guess, for the state. And what about in your case, Lisa?
So, fortunately, election directors and election officials are serial planners by nature. So we plan for the worst possible thing we can think of and then make contingency plans. So I'll say we've planned here for power outages, last minute emergency changes in locations, all voters showing up, no voters showing up, things like measles outbreak, flu. I don't think anybody really ever planned a pandemic, a worldwide pandemic. And we actually had 5 elections in Cochise County last year. We had the 3 statewide, and then we had 2 jurisdictional. So 4 out of those 5 were conducted in a pandemic. So safety, of course, was a challenge. I'm going to say that I'm very grateful to the governor and the Secretary of State for assistance with the CARES funding and purchasing supplies for us, because even though our Board of Supervisors is very good with the budget, they know we have to spend what we have to spend. Didn't matter how much money you had. You couldn't find Clorox wipes. You couldn't find cleaner. You couldn't find those things. So we were grateful that they purchased those items in bulk and sent them to counties around the state. So those were really, really good assets for us. We had total voter turnout about 74% in this county. 80% was early. Normally we get 800 or 900 people voting early. We had almost 3,000 early in person. So I say all the time, other states wish they were Arizona because we have such great opportunities for voters and we have such good laws and procedures in place for voters.
And Tammy, I want to go to you. What were you seeing nationally in terms of election officials' preparations for, well, not just the presidential election, but the elections that were ongoing, right, for the last 2 years or so? Tammy, you're muted.
A year into this, more than a year, and I still forget to take myself off mute. It's one of these days I'll learn. I think one of the things that's always important to remember about any election is that every election has a misstep or two here or there, whether it's the door to a polling place that doesn't get opened or there's a printing error in one location or another. But last year was really a testament to the fortitude and dedication of thousands of election officials, as well as the American voters. So we know that all across the country, hundreds of thousands of individuals worked the polls who had never worked the polls before. We know that millions of people registered and voted who had literally never voted before. And we also know that it was the most secure, most transparent, most audited, most observed election with the highest number of voters that this country has ever seen. So why is it that November was the huge success that it was? And why was it that it wasn't a super spreader event. A lot of it comes down to the lessons that we learned in the primaries as COVID started to roll out across the country. And we can get into some of those details, but I think that was really critical, is that we did have a dry run of how do you administer an election in a global pandemic? How do you make sure voters have options? And as was stated, many states were not as well positioned as Arizona to service their voters in a pandemic. Many states, you have to go to the polls on Tuesday during the 10 or 12 hours that they allow. And those states really struggled. So I'm happy to get into the weedy details of how these things played out across the country, because it really was a case-by-case basis of where legislators and others that determine the policy, where they listened to the election officials, and how to best service the electorate in a global pandemic.
Thank you for that, Tammy. Gina, I want to go to you. You mentioned misinformation that was rampant in the 2020 elections. When did you start seeing this misinformation start cropping up? And if you can delve specifically into the specific questions that people were asking of you and how you responded to them.
Sure. So I think we really started to see it ramp up during the summertime, and a lot of it had to do with initially ballot by mail. There were a lot of concerns about the security of ballot by mail, misunderstanding about the system in general. We heard from voters who thought that Arizona automatically sends a ballot to every voter in the state. We are not an all-mail state. So you're only getting a ballot if you actually requested a ballot, whether that's being on the permanent early voting list or one-time ballot request. There were concerns about, do early ballots count, and how is the identity of the voter verified? So we were really seeing concerns about the security and the legitimacy of ballot by mail. And then we saw that progress as we got closer into election day for the November election, where we saw a lot of concerns on election day, such as, I'll refer to Sharpiegate, for example, as it's now being called. Voters had concerns about the type of pen that they were given in Maricopa County and the fact that it bled through on the other side. And a video from that outside the polling place went viral. And so we saw a lot of voters contacting our office about, were only a certain political affiliation of voters given a certain type of pen, and were those ballots not counted? What happened to my ballot? How do I confirm my ballot was counted? And we just saw a lot of misinformation about that process, that your ballot would not be counted, and going so far as to say that only certain voters were given that pen. We had a lot of voters contact our office about that. So those are just two examples that jumped to the top of my head that were really big issues for voters.
How did Sharpiegate change the mood of the elections, if you will, if it did?
I think it really cast doubt on the election day voters and verifying that your ballot was counted. We saw things. Okay, so for example, when you vote by mail, you can go track the status of your early ballot and you can confirm that it was counted. That's how you can do that online through the Secretary of State's portal or directly through Maricopa County or Pima County. So as a voter, your early ballot counted. Election day voters, how do you know your ballot counted? You know it because you fed it through the machine at the polling station. That's your ballot being counted right then and there, or it goes into a secure box and it's later tabulated at central count, which you can view online. So we saw voters who were going online to confirm the status of their early ballot, and they would see a statement saying it was canceled. And instead of contacting their election official, we saw voters I think now it's become instinct to post on social media now, instead of actually verifying first directly through the source. And what that ended up being was the voter was issued an early ballot, and it was canceled because they ended up coming on election day to vote. And so that was accurate. And it just came down to voter education. How does the voter understand what the system is, what is being sent to them? And I think all of that, the impact was a loss of trust in a system. So it really got into the weeds of the election administration. We saw so many voters really having high interest in how the elections are administered and how they can confirm their ballot was counted. And not just that their ballot was received, but they wanted to know their actual votes. And in Arizona, we have a right to a secret ballot. So you have the constitutional right to a secret ballot. So we can't go pull your specific ballot and tell you who exactly you voted for. So it was a combination of those things. And I think a lot of that misunderstanding and misinformation really started to erode the confidence in our electoral system.
Thank you, Gina. I actually want to spend just a couple of minutes here delving into some of the questions that were asked, and if we can just get clarification on those. And I'm gonna rely on Lisa and Leslie on this couple of questions. So Lisa, early ballots are counted last.
That is a real common this misinformation mistake. Early ballots are counted first. We can start tabulating those ballots 14 days prior to the election currently. So those start getting counted those 14 days. And the first results we release on election night at 8 o'clock, those are most of the early ballots. So that's why it looks like there's this big influx of ballots, because that's true. They are counted first in Arizona.
Leslie, if your ballot is received in the mail, you must return it by mail.
Incorrect. You have multiple ways in Arizona to return your ballot. You can use the postal service. We have drop boxes. In our county, we have 19 drop boxes throughout the county. You can drop it off at either one of our offices, my main office in Prescott, or you can go to Cottonwood. We have an annex there, or on election day at any of our vote centers. So you have multiple ways of returning your ballot, whatever's most convenient and whatever you're comfortable with.
Leslie, same question to you as well. If the signature on the affidavit envelope doesn't match the voter record, it's not counted.
Nope, that's incorrect also. We do everything possible to contact our voters. If we get it early in the election, we'll send a letter. We'll email, we text message, any way that we can possibly reach out to people. Any contact information we have, we call. We have found that the text messaging, we get the biggest response, because most of us will look at a text message before we pick up the phone if we hear it ringing. You know, a lot of us are on meetings all day, so we can still look at our phone and see that text message. So we get really good response, but we do everything we possibly can to inform the voters if we find an inconsistency with their signatures.
Lisa, if a voter can't cure his or her signature by 7 p.m. on election day, their ballot is not counted.
That's really a Leslie question, because it's a recorder who verifies those. You know, in Arizona, we're really fortunate that we have such strict guidelines, and we have really good separation of powers.
Leslie, what's the answer to that question?
If your signature is there, but it is not consistent with what we have on file, we will continue to call up to 5 days for a general election, 3 days for a primary. If your signature is missing, then we do not call after 7 p.m.
So maybe a question for Gina. If I get an early ballot, I can't go to the polls on election day and vote. Is that true?
No, the great thing about Arizona, and I want to highlight what Lisa had said earlier, Arizona really is a remarkable state. So if you get an early ballot and you decide you don't want to vote it, you can absolutely go to the polls and vote your ballot. So depending on your county and the equipment they have, if they can tell in real time that you did not already return that and vote that early ballot, you'll be issued a regular ballot. If that's not able to be verified by the poll worker, then you'll be issued a provisional ballot. What happens is that provisional ballot goes back to the county. They confirm that you did not already vote, and then that provisional will count. So you can absolutely vote on election day if you received an early ballot.
Lisa, if I'm on vacation or if I'm abroad, I can't vote.
That's not true either. I love that we're able to clear up some of these misinformation statements, because they're so frequent out there. You can be on the permanent early voting list, or you can request a one-time ballot through your recorder's office. Most of that can be done online. You can contact your recorder and they can make sure that you have a ballot. There's a deadline to cut off before they cannot send that to you. But if you request them, they can send that ballot to you and you can return it.
I guess same question to you. Well, not same question. Question for you as well. If a voter say that they lost his or her ballot, their ballot, they can request another one and then vote twice.
They can request another one, but the system, the way it's set up, only one vote can be counted. We can't accept multiple ballots. The system just won't allow that. So the ballot that we receive back is the ballot that is counted.
And Leslie, multiple ballots can be created and voted by so-called bad actors. If delivered to the elections department, they will then be tabulated.
They still have to go through the recorder's office for signature verification. And to mirror what Lisa said, first ballot in is the first one counted. Each ballot that comes in is that's how you get your voter history. Comes to the recorder's office, they verify that signature and say, like, Lisa has already voted. Another one comes in, and that does not get processed.
I want to go to Tammy. Tammy, what did you see nationally in terms of mail-in ballots? Obviously, a lot of states, a lot of counties, many of them were compelled to expand, mail-in voting because of COVID-19. But if you can give us an overview of what was happening in the country elsewhere, not just in Arizona.
I think that all of the things that have been mentioned already just point to the fact that for years, election officials kind of lamented that they toiled away in obscurity and no one would come to the press conference. No one came to logic and accuracy tests. No one wanted to volunteer to do the audit. It was hard to get poll workers because there was this assumption that elections were uniform all across the country and the specifics didn't matter as much. But what we saw last year is that there is still such confusion around just even what's come up so far today around knowing how you voted. Election officials don't know how you personally voted. They trigger that you sent in a ballot or that you signed in, but no one knows how you voted. And that's really critical. There's even been comments about that here today. And the way in which people have options in how to register, when to vote, it varies so dramatically across the country that when you hear about one thing in one state, oh, we could pick, I don't know, Pennsylvania or Georgia, it's automatically an assumption that it is a problem in your own home state. And that's when it's really challenging. We saw this last year in the amplification of information across the social platforms to weaponize things like voting by mail. So voting by mail has been the prevalent method of voting in Arizona for decades. In fact, Republican Secretary of State Kim Wyman in Washington State likes to tease Arizona. She says, if you have 70, 80, 90% of your people voting by mail, you're a vote by mail state. You just won't admit it. So here we had a situation last year where the main channel of voting, tens of millions of voters have voted by mail for decades in this country, was really weaponized and created confusion around whether or not people should trust it. So we know that since 1988, voting by mail has been a standard get out the vote for the GOP, for the Republicans. And there was some real tension last year when former President Trump started calling into question the legitimacy of voting by mail. Within the own party, they were very concerned. And so there were some real challenges around combating that information and for election officials specifically in this very chaotic situation where they weren't sure how voters would return their ballots. Would they return them early, which thankfully in Arizona they did. Many people leveraged and utilized some of the drop boxes and getting those ballots back, not waiting to drop them off at the polls on election day, so that ballots were in fact counted in that first tally. And this is one of the challenges when we talk about the 2020 election, is not only was last year the most successful election I think ever administered in this country, but unfortunately, we have a section of the population that doesn't believe that because they're not being told the truth. They're not being told the truth about the election. They're not engaging and participating in hand count audits, which have been done in Arizona for decades. And that's where we really have a challenge. And I'm very concerned because this cuts to the heart of a healthy democracy. In a healthy democracy, people engage in the process, eligible voters make their voices heard. At the end of the day, the votes are counted, or the end of the period. I don't mean to imply that you have a result on election day, because heaven forbid you don't, right? It's when the votes are canvassed, you have the opportunity to go through the courts. You have the opportunity and make sure that everything is audited under state law. All of those things happened in Arizona. And yet, and still, here we are, months after the election, where there's still individuals that believe that there was something nefarious. And the challenge is all across the country, legislatures and individuals are looking to Arizona, they're looking to Georgia, and they're using that as a reason to change their own practices. Iowa completely revamped some of their election laws, which there's no reason. Iowa had a fabulous election, but it's being used as a way to change the way in which individuals in a state engage with their democracy. And that also is incredibly problematic.
So I want to go to Leslie. I want to talk to you about the innovations that you implemented in your county to make sure that voters can access the ballot in the middle of a pandemic. And of course, it turned out to be, in your case, 87% of voters voted. That's pretty high turnout. But walk us through some of the innovations that you implemented in your county, and which you might in fact see again in 2022.
Well, we just did the same thing that we have been doing. We did a whole lot more voter education, reaching out, explaining to people, you can come in, vote that 27 days. That seems to be one of the hardest messages to get out to our voters, is they can come in early and vote 27 days prior to the election. They can call for a one-time ballot for those people that like to come in on election day, but they're nervous because of the pandemic, or again, being out of town, that was mentioned. You can call, you can email, we'll get you that one-time ballot. The drop boxes, we'll continue with those. We did get 6 additional boxes in between the primary and general, which helped. And those are things that will carry on into 2022. We're certainly hoping we're not dealing with a pandemic. And then security is another major focus with elections. And I know that is across the whole country. And we have worked with our IT department with putting up really good firewalls. And we've also worked on physical security, installing more cameras that we will carry forward. And as we know, technology grows so rapidly that we have to keep up on that. That's probably one of our biggest priorities. And I can see that being a priority from now going forward for all elections. And we also have vote centers in Yavapai County. And pretty much statewide now, we have a lot of our counties that have been able to go to vote centers so that you can vote anywhere in your county. You don't have to vote in your precinct. We did that in 2012, and our voters embraced that.
I'm sorry, did you say that you started the voting centers idea back in 2012?
Yes. Yes.
And you've done it in every election cycle then?
Yes. Now, all of our jurisdictional elections are by mail. Excuse me. They're all by mail, but yes, we did that. In fact, when Tammy was appointed to the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, we went up, our elections director and I, Lynn, her and I went to Denver to speak to the commission about the success of our vote centers. And that was named as one of the best practices that's due to election administration practices. That's one of the top, I believe, 5.
So Lisa, I want to go to you. So insofar as the vote centers, what is the advantage, if you can flesh it out just really quickly, what is the advantage of a vote center versus a voting precinct? I can tell you in my instance, for example, when we have voting precincts, I got to go find my voting precinct, right? So there was one election cycle, for example, I went to the wrong one, and then they told me it was another one. And so I went there, and so it took me not a very long time to go find my real voting center, but the voting precincts, at least in my area, changed a couple times. And so I had to make sure that I'm going to the right place. With the voting center, of course, then, you can vote anywhere. But tell us, what other advantages did you see with voting centers? And I'm presuming voting centers will be a part of your elections as well going forward.
That's correct. Cochise County moved to vote centers in 2015. Prior to that, we had 49 precincts in Cochise County, so we had to have a vote polling location in every one of those. Those do change, and that is confusing for voters. The big advantage, there are several for vote centers. It's up to voters to choose where they want to vote on election day. We're a very large county geographically, and so it's not unusual to live in one place, work somewhere that's maybe 30, 40 miles away. So you have options. You don't have to just go and wait to be led into your voting center. So that's huge for people. We have found that vote center locations don't really change that much because they're consistent. So people get to know where they are. I think the out of voting precinct is an issue and has been in some court cases. So at least with vote centers, you don't have that. One little challenge we have is with people in other counties who may be here from Pima County or from Maricopa County, and you can't vote in a vote center outside of your county. That's the one prerequisite.
How
But
did you deal with them, by the way, when those voters showed up at your voting centers? How did you deal with them?
you explain that. The poll workers are trained to explain that. And at the end of the day, no one is turned away. So if they, they want to vote, they're given a provisional ballot, which then is gotten to the recorder's office and they're verified. And then those ballots don't count because they're not eligible registered voters in this county. It's rare. We get a couple of them maybe every election.
Gina, I want to go to you. So let's talk about 2022. Given the experience that we had in last year, as you're preparing for 2022, what kinds of programs do you have in mind, either from 2020 or new programs that you have in mind on the voter outreach side of things, but on the misinformation side of things, for example?
Thank you for that question, Luigi. As I'm listening to what some of the panelists are saying and to what I'm seeing in the chat here, we talk a lot about how Arizona has what our electoral system is like and potential changes with policies and procedures. And I am going to champion this. And I think voter education really is the solution to all of the major issues that we're seeing right now. And that's what you'll see coming from Clean Elections in 2022 is a greater increase in our efforts to educate voters about how the election administration works so that we can hopefully restore confidence in the system. There's questions that really range from, I'll go to what Tammy said, in that election officials have no idea how you vote. We have no idea which candidate you voted for on the ballot. So how do we verify that your vote was tabulated correctly? We have what are called logic and accuracy testing. They're done both before and after the election, and they verify that the right votes are going into the right bucket for the right candidate. That's an open public meeting for voters to participate in. There is a statistically significant hand count that is done to verify the accuracy of the machines. We talk about voter identification. Every single voter in the state must have their identity verified before their ballot was counted, regardless of how they're voting, whether they're voting by mail or they're voting in person. Every voter must show ID. Arizona has a proof of citizenship requirement. If you want to vote in state elections, you must verify your citizenship. How can you confirm that your ballot was counted? All of these concerns that we're seeing from voters, down to what pen that they're using, we think that the solution to this is educating them on the process, because we do have a great system. We have policies and procedures that have been developed over decades with our election officials in Arizona are wonderful. They have so much history and best practices, and they have been committed to Arizona's electoral system for years. And so out of that have come really great best practices. And I think just simply educating voters on this process, letting them know, because we really can address all voters' concerns through voter education. I think that's
I'm sorry, did you say you can address all of them?
We can. I really do believe we can address all of their concerns through voter education. And that's what we're going to see in 2022. We're really going to see an increase in voter education. Leslie mentioned that they did a greater increase in Yavapai County. I think that's what really needs to be the focus.
I want to go to Tammy. Tammy, as you see election officials start to prepare for 2022, tell us about what the potential problem areas might be and how election officials can respond to them and overcome them. And of course, I guess the overarching question would be, how do, given the experience that we had in 2020, how do election officials really, to a certain extent, get people's confidence back up in the way we've run our elections?
So here's I think the biggest challenge is that there is dissatisfaction by about a quarter to a third of the voting population and of the public, where nothing will satisfy them. Literally, the ballots in Georgia were counted 3 times and they still were not satisfied. In Arizona, there has been a hand count audit in Maricopa County. There was a forensic audit. There were logic and accuracy tests done post-election. It is not that anyone is discounting the public's concern around the integrity of the elections, but at a certain point in time, people need to just take the truth, take their good medicine, and move on. The challenge that we have is that Elections, by their very nature, have winners and losers. And the very construct of our democracy is that at the end of the day, when everything is counted, everything is audited, and the results are proven in the courts, in the tabulation centers, and elsewhere to be accurate and correct, that we accept them, we embrace them, and we move forward with those who have been elected. But at this point in time, we still have a portion of individuals where nothing will satisfy them. Look at the audit that's happening in Arizona. The goalposts keep moving. Every couple of days, now I'm hearing, oh, well, this audit isn't any good because it didn't take place within MCTEC itself. That's the only thing we need. If we could just redo the whole thing within those walls, then we'll be satisfied. There's nothing to satisfy those individuals. Some people believe the earth is flat and nothing will convince them otherwise. So election officials in this environment need to just continually speak truth to power. Those who have been elected on the very same ballots that were counted multiple times and who have the podium need to start speaking the truth about what has happened. We need to reinforce the good laws that are in place in states. But here's the other issue and challenge. Even places like Arizona, where they have had some of the best practices in election administration for decades, there are changes being introduced and proposed as though there's a problem to remedy. And that's happening all across the country. So voters in states that have been voting by mail for decades, Washington, Oregon, even in Colorado, voters there now believe that there's an issue with their election systems, and they're calling it into question, even though it's been that way for decades and has never shown any sort of partisan implication or what have you. So at a certain level, we all need to take a deep breath and recognize what the truth is, and recognize that in an open, free, and just democracy, we have open procedures to register to vote. All eligible voters should be able to, unencumbered, get registered and pick options in how and when to vote, particularly in a pandemic, so that they and themselves and their communities can remain safe. So as we move into next year, this is going to be the challenge. We saw a huge turnout last year, a lot of first-time voters, but in many of these states, the rules of engagement have changed and will continue to change this year before we get to next year's midterm election. So Gina's absolutely right. Voter education and information is critical. Academic studies have shown last year that in the states that received some of the additional funding through the CARES Act and some of the philanthropic dollars that were used to educate voters on the hours the polling places were open, their location, how to return a ballot, how to use the drop box. Those places had more successful engagement with their voters, but that was an anomaly. Election officials are not well resourced. And in states like Arizona, they're passing laws to say you can't receive additional funding, and that is incredibly problematic.
Thank you, Tammy. I want to go to Leslie. Ma'am, as you prepare for 2022, I was wondering if you can talk about the poll workers and whether there are fears, for example, that you might not get as many. Now, in your county, that's probably less of an issue because you have a pretty actively engaged community. I mean, 87% voter turnout, that's pretty high. But if you can talk to us about how you're preparing for 2022 and ensuring that you do have the poll workers that you need. And of course, right now we have COVID-19. We don't know if we're going to have COVID 2022 next year. Maybe COVID 2021 at some point down the road. I pray not. But talk to us about those.
I've talked to our elections director, Lynn Constable, because she does that elections day. And again, it's going to be reaching out to our public. And I have to say the national push for 2022 was amazing when it came to poll workers. We had more than we could use. And that's definitely an anomaly, because getting poll workers in, and then you throw a pandemic in, and we had some that were afraid and didn't want to come. I do have a bit of an older demographic, so a lot of them were very cautious and hesitant. But the whole national push on help, go to, be engaged, go to the polls, help be a poll worker. And she ended up with more than we needed. We're hoping that that leads to future, because the ones who had never participated before were amazed at the process. That helped their confidence in the process immensely. And that's our best word, is people who've worked in it going out and saying, I was there, I helped, and they want to come back. So there'll still be that push. And I think that with this pandemic, more people want to be involved. And somebody said it in chats. education equals confidence. And being involved, we also do our Follow Your Ballot tour, which we will push going forward. We haven't this last year, and that helps people come in, see the equipment, watch exactly what we do from start to finish has been a big plus. And we got a lot of poll workers from that, people who were concerned. They wanted to see really what we did. Once they did, they said, well, like, now I want to be a part of it. So just being engaged with the community helps tremendously and gets them into help us.
And then did I hear you correctly? You actually have more poll workers than the jobs available for them?
For 2020, yes, Lynn had more poll workers than she could use, which I don't know that that's ever happened.
And Lisa, what about in your case now?
That was actually the same situation in Cochise County. There were major efforts to get poll workers across the state, from the Secretary of State's office, as well as advocacy groups. But we have a very loyal following here, and we had to turn poll workers away as well. We tried to take as many new ones as we can, because I think that's really important, learning how the system works. And we talk about voter education, and it's important, but let's look at, people don't have TV for the most part anymore. We're getting news from online, and we can do all the education and outreach we want, but if they're not paying attention to the messaging, that's a problem. So when you get actual citizens out there doing the work, they can help with that. They can combat the misinformation. I always tell people, call your election directors. Maybe it's easier in a smaller rural county where we all know each other. We're at the grocery store. I mean, they ask you questions everywhere. And that's good, because then we can make sure we get the correct information out there to people. I think it's also important to talk to other election officials across the country. None of us have ever been shy about that, but especially this past year, we spent much time on Zoom meetings, team meetings, phone calls, learning what worked, what didn't work. And that was really helpful. We'll definitely push that forward. We talked a little bit about some innovations and things we did differently. And whenever there's a problem, and this has been 2020 was a horrible year for lots of reasons, you can always find some bright spots. For us, it was technology, because groups couldn't get together in large numbers, which is required for poll worker training. Many people across this state and this country did online poll worker training, ramped that up and got that out so we could still train the poll workers, because that's required under law and really important. So lots of great things came out of that election, and I hope more people pick up the phone, call your recorder, call your election director, ask these questions so that you can help us combat that misinformation and disinformation, which sometimes isn't deliberately, intentionally spread. I mean, say I came from another state that did things differently. Well, I just assume it's going to be that way in the state I move, and that's not true. So we get a lot of misinformation that way.
I want to ask you a couple of questions just on election day, and I want to wade through some of these questions and let's see if we can, make sense of them. So, and again, anyone can jump in. Provisional ballots are only counted if the race is close. I want to go to Leslie for that one.
No, every qualified provisional ballot is tabulated.
A ballot is not tabulated if all races are not voted. Leslie?
That's always been a misconception. Even was one of mine as a young voter, thinking you had to vote all races. You do not. You vote one race, that's tabulated.
Gina, if I make a mistake on my ballot, I'm out of luck.
No, you can always request a new ballot. So if you make a mistake, we call them spoiled ballots. You just need to reach out to your election official, and you can get another one if you're at the polls, or if you want to get another one mailed to you. As long as there's still time to do that, you can definitely get a replacement ballot.
Lisa, voting in multiple states is okay so long as you don't vote for the same races.
That's absolutely incorrect, and that is not a good thing. That's not a good practice, and that could get you some jail time.
I'm saying it's a felony offense if you did that, correct?
Correct.
If I bring my mail ballot to a voting location on election day, I have to wait in line.
That's
No.
absolutely a big change. We've never had that. You don't have to wait in line. But this year, because again, COVID, and trying to control crowds and trying to control numbers, most counties in Arizona and across the country actually that had the ability to drop off a ballot had outside what we called curbside ballot drop off that was stationed with qualified election officials and a secure ballot box. So if a voter didn't want to go inside, they could just drop their ballot off there. And that worked well. I think we'll be looking at that in the future. Now, voters still have the option to take it inside if they wanted, but that was really, voters appreciate that. At the end of the day, it's about voters. They appreciate secure drop boxes. They appreciate the options they get in Arizona.
Gina, I want to ask you one of the questions.
If I could,
Yeah, go ahead, Tammy.
I was just gonna say, if I could add on to one thing about the drive-through drop-offs, the drive-through voting, that was something that came about in a much greater usage last year. And it was one of those things that in one state like Iowa, it was embraced as a best practice. Look at how great this is. Voters don't even have to get out of their car. And in other states like Texas, it was seen as a challenge and an issue, and they tried to shut it down. So this is one of the areas where, as we look across the country, we want to make sure that we're really recognizing that the practices can be best for voters as long as they're secure and accessible, because you have to have both of those things. And there are examples. I don't want to sound like I'm all doom and gloom. Look to places like Kentucky, where they have bipartisan legislation that codified some of these great practices from last year. They didn't have any early voting in Kentucky last year. They didn't have any way of consolidating polling places before last year. And their Republican secretary said, this is fabulous. We need to make this law and codify it moving forward. So there are places around the country where they're looking at some of these practices that Arizona has been doing for a very long time very well, and making sure that their voters also have access to it.
Sorry, I was muted there for a second. Gina, I want to ask you a question about the logic and accuracy test. When does this happen? Is this after the votes?
There's two done. So the first logic and accuracy test is done prior to the election, prior to any ballots being tabulated on that equipment. So you have your early voting equipment, your election day equipment. The way that LNA test works, it's done twofold. So one, you have the Arizona Secretary of State's office. They come to every single county and they do a random test on a random sampling of the equipment. And they do that for the federal and state elections. And so they test that equipment, and it's done in observance of the political parties. And again, it's open to the public, and they sign off on that equipment.
When you say, I'm sorry, you said it's an observance of the political parties. So the major parties are there.
The major parties are invited, and hopefully they come in and attend. And again, anybody from the public can come as well too. It's an open meeting. So that's done by the Secretary of State's office. Then the county is required to test every single piece of equipment. Now, how do you know that nothing changed between that test and election day? There's another one done post-election. So after election day, another LNA test is done. And again, all of the equipment is tested again to verify that the program didn't change, that that the right votes are going into the right bucket. So you have that test done both before any ballots are going to be started to be tabulated on the equipment, and then you have it done after as well.
And in both instances, you have observers from both parties, from the and the public is invited as well.
Correct.
Oh, I want to go. There's a lot of questions. Thank you for being such an engaged audience. I can see there's a ton of them. We'll start to wade through some of these questions. Gina, this probably is a question for you. There's a question about the voter rolls and the need to clean them up every so often. Can you tell us, and it's probably outside of our purview because this is something that the legislature has to decide, but your thoughts, ma'am?
Sure. So the voter rolls, there are a lot of different mechanisms that impact the voter rolls. That, again, I think this comes down to voter education. So for example, death records. DHS sends the death records to the Secretary of State's office, and those are compared against the statewide voter registration database to see if there are any matches. That's one way. Then the other way, and this is a very common way, and this is through the NVRA process, election mail. Election mail is non-forwardable. So anytime, and this is important for voters too, if you're going to be traveling during an election, just remember that election mail is non-forwardable. So if two pieces of election mail are sent back to the county as non-deliverable, or the person not at this address, that triggers the NVRA mailing process. And so what that does is the county's going to try to reach out to that voter, and we want to confirm, do you still live at this address? We're trying to verify that you're there. And if the county doesn't hear back from the voter, they get placed on what's called the inactive list. So they're not canceled, they're just placed on the inactive list. And they remain there through 2 federal election cycles, unless they vote, then or contact the county, and then they're placed back on the active list. You can still vote when you're on the inactive list. But through that process, so it takes a few years, then at that point, the voter's record can be canceled. So there's a lot of different ways that the voter rolls are cleaned up. And, we have the national change of address information, and Arizona is part of the ERIC group. So we have a lot of different mechanisms that our election officials use to make sure that the voter rolls are cleaned up.
Here's one question from Kelly, and I think Leslie or Lisa, you can answer this one. What happened to those voters who came in person to vote and were told that they had already cast a ballot?
Lisa, I'll let you answer that because it's the election day, but I would like to address a little bit more about cleaning the rolls.
Go ahead, ma'am.
Lisa, do you want to do it, and then I'll follow?
Yeah, sure. So again, no one is turned away. So if we got your early ballot, you requested it, or you're on PVL, you got it, we got it returned to us. It wasn't that you were just told you had to go away, you couldn't vote. We said, in our case, in our county, we just see that you have gotten sent a ballot. We don't have the live data to say it's back. So you vote a provisional ballot, which again is verified, and then those ballots are counted if they're valid.
Here's another question. How can a person, and this is from Baird, how can a person verify their address is being used to vote fraudulently? I routinely get mail for 12 to 15 people at my address, many of which are obviously fictitious names. Again, this is according to Baird. And some items appear to be pandemic stimulus payments. So I guess the question is, for example, if you're getting other people's mail in your mail, then the question from Baird, I guess, broadly speaking, is how can you be confident in the mail-in ballot system? And, Gina, you want to answer this one, or Tammy?
Go ahead, Tammy.
I would answer that one. So I've been working with the Postal Service for over a decade. And part of the issue is if you get mail at your home for someone who no longer lives there, you should return it to sender. As Gina laid out, the National Voter Registration Act, only when that material gets returned to the county recorder's office will they be able to start the process of moving the voter to an inactive status under the National Voter Registration Act and Arizona's interpretation of it. And I say that very specifically because there are many states that when they get the national change of address information from the Postal Service, they automatically change the voter's address to the new address that the post office has given them. But in Arizona, it requires the voter to make that step in confirming where they have lived. So if you're receiving mail and you're just throwing it away, that's why you're going to continue to get mail. What you want to do is make sure that you put it back into the mail stream, put return to sender. They don't live here anymore, whatever you'd like to put on there, but make sure that it gets sent back to all of the individuals that are mailing that mail so that they get correct and updated information. That's really the best thing you can do. Otherwise, you will continue to get mail at that address. It could be someone that's lived there years ago. It could be other people's bad mailing addresses, that sort of thing.
And Leslie, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, and back to cleaning of the rolls. We are required by law to send a notice every 2 years before any state or federal election. And it's sent by non-forwardable mail. That's one of the ways that we do clean our rolls. It comes back, then we have a notice that we send out. They have 35 days to respond. If they don't respond in that 35 days, then they're moved to the inactive list. They don't get a ballot. They remain on that list until they notify us, or they go in to vote, then they go to provisional, and that's where they can update that address. In addition to the death records that come from DHS to the Secretary of State, we also get felony records that are provided. We get notices from the courts. We see that people get their jury questionnaires and they don't want to be on the jury, so they mark felon. Well, we get that. They're taken off the rolls because they have just self-identified as a felon. We do try to get that out to people. Please don't do that, because then you're going to be very angry when you go in on election day to vote and realize that you've been removed. But we do that. Also, we get court records if somebody has been deemed incompetent. So we get those. We get several records every month. We get those records. They go through the Secretary of State and then on to us. They do any hard matches. We'll automatically cancel that voter registration file or record. Any what we call soft matches, they have to meet a certain criteria. They come to us to process those. And then we use a national change of address. Gina had mentioned that. We get notice from the post office. Every time somebody does a change of address, we get a notice and we bump that off of our voter registration rolls. And we're working constantly to clean those rolls. And we encourage people. Just yesterday, I saw 2 or 3 emails come in from people stating, my spouse has passed, my uncle has passed. So we send them a notice so that they sign it and send it back. We can't just take their word for it. We send it to them, they return it to us in a self-addressed envelope. We do everything we can to try to keep those rolls clean. And then again, for the responsibility of the individuals, please help us in returning that mail to the post office.
We are almost out of time, and I want to give each of you a chance to, what is your most hopeful scenario for 2022? Mine is obviously we have an election that's very efficiently run, and we won't see long lines, and the counting is going to be fast and efficient. I mean, those are my 3 hopes for 2022. Let me begin with Gina.
I really hope that we continue to see a trend in increasing voter turnout and our participation rates. I really want to see voters engaged. And I hope that for people who still have concerns about the 2020 election, and as we continue to progress through this year, I hope that it won't be a deterrent, that people will still continue to turn out and vote, and that they vote informed, that they take the time to educate themselves about the candidates and the issues. And also, if they have those concerns and they continue to have them, that they contact their election officials directly to learn more about the process. I think we've seen social media and how that can really exacerbate issues. I encourage voters, if you have concerns at all, contact your election officials. I've spent hours on the phone with voters. We will spend the time with you to educate you about the process and go through all of your concerns with a fine-tooth comb. So I really want to see that engagement from voters in 2022. And we do have all of the statewide offices on the ballot in Arizona. So hopefully our voters will continue to turn out.
Tammy, just real quick, ma'am.
Yeah, also, I think, for any concerns that people still have, to make sure, as Gina mentioned, reach out to your state and local election officials, learn more about the process, volunteer to be a poll worker, volunteer to work the central boards, or board workers, sorry. Arizona says board worker, volunteer to be a central poll worker, working, adjudicating provisionals and all the things that need to happen, become part of the solution rather than not understanding the process, not seeing all the safeguards that are really there. So that's my hope for moving forward, is that we continue to be engaged.
Lisa?
I would say responsibility from election officials, elected people in office, and voters. We've all got responsibility to move forward, and we can do it.
And finally, Leslie, ma'am.
I agree. It's going to be all of us working together. Call us. We are available all the time. And anybody who has questions that have come through the chat that haven't been answered, start the calls now. Give any of us a call. Give your election official, recorder, elections director a call, because that person-to-person contact is a lot better than trying to send emails. We'll take those calls. We'll work with you and engage and be responsible along with us. Help us help you. So we're there for our voters.
And I'm sorry, Luigi, if I could just cut in real quick. I just wanted to let everybody, the audience, know we saw a lot of questions in the chat, and there was a suggestion that we take those and respond to them and make them available online. So I'll make sure that we do that, and we'll have that posted at azcleanelections.gov.
Perfect. And with that, Tammy, Leslie, Lisa, and Gina, I want to thank you again for your time. To our viewers and to our listeners, thank you for spending 1 hour with us. I really thank every one of you who asked the questions and were really engaged. And of course, I want to thank the Arizona Citizens Clean Elections Commission for sponsoring today's Morning Scoop. And with that, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.